Welcome back to Face the Nation. 2 years ago, South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn urged President Biden to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court. Last week, the president fulfilled that promise and picked Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Congressman Clyburn joins us now from Santee, South Carolina. Good morning to you, Congressman.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
You know, how important is it for President Biden to have this vote for this particular historic choice be bipartisan?
This is beyond politics. This is about the country, our pursuit of a more perfect union, and this is demonstrative of another step in that pursuit. And I would hope that all of my Republican friends will look upon it that way. Let's have a debate. Let's talk to her about her rulings and about her philosophy. But in the final analysis, let's have a strong bipartisan support to demonstrate that both parties are still in pursuit of perfection.
Congressman, you spoke very passionately the last time you were on this program about your first choice, the South Carolina native, Judge Michelle Childs. And one of the reasons you argued it was important to have someone like her, you said, was because she went to state schools. Judge Brown Jackson went to Harvard, an elite institution. Does that affect how you see this? Is it less powerful because of that?
It's more traditional. There's no question about that. This means that we will continue that tradition. And I am one, as you can see, that's not so much for tradition. I want to see us break as much new ground as possible. But having said that, we all have our personal preferences. We all have our regional biases. But in the final analysis, I think this was a good choice. It was a choice that brings onto the court a background and some experiences that nobody else on the court will have. And I think when you look at not just her background and the family life, but also her profession. She was a public defender. That adds a new perspective to the court.
Congressman, the president will deliver his State of the Union address this coming week, and we know that his approval ratings have fallen among virtually every group over the past year. But according to our CBS polling, the drop has been especially steep among Black Americans, down from 87% to 66% approval. And it's inflation, time and again, that shows up over every single group as one of the biggest things weighing on the president.
Well, inflation is a problem for everybody. But the fact of the matter is, it is more of a problem for those people who have very little or nothing to inflate. And so the president has a job here of trying to do what is necessary to get people back to work, to get incomes in people's homes, to get people in homes. All of this adds to his problem. And so when you have a group such as African Americans that have little in the first place, inflation comes, it depresses their family incomes even more. So that is a concern. It's also a concern, as I said earlier, when you have an opportunity to make an appointment like he just had, and he made an African American appointment, I guarantee you see some of that move up. Mm-hmm. It may not move up with the people who are having income problems, but it will move up to those who have other reservations about the president.
Congressman, two prominent Democrats came out this week with some words of advice to the Democratic Party, Michael Bloomberg and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and both said that Democrats need a course correction. Bloomberg said parties headed for wipeout in November up and down the ballot because it's distracted. Voters perceive the party too focused on culture wars. Secretary Clinton also said we can't get distracted, whether it's the latest culture war nonsense or some new right-wing lie on Fox or Facebook. Do you agree that these things are problems?
Well, culture wars are a problem, but it's not coming from the Democrats.
But the focus by Democrats on that.
Well, I don't think any of us are focused on that, but we cannot allow these kinds of things to float around out there. When you're talking about critical race theory, we aren't putting that out there, but you can't stand idly by and allow that to exist. We have a critical race problem in this country, and we know it, and we got to stand up to it. We can't let people just take Black history out of the school's agenda and call it a theory. These are racial facts. It is just important to me, for my grandchildren, to learn about Louis Latimer as it is to learn about Thomas Edison. But for Louis Latimer, Thomas Edison's light bulb would never have worked. And those are facts that should stay in our classrooms. And when people are taking books of Black authors out of the schools, that to me cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged.
Congressman Clyburn, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll be right back. We now return to the war raging in Ukraine with former National Security Advisor R Mcmaster. He's now at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and with us this morning. Good to see you in person.
Hey, good to see you, Margaret.
So the president has made clear he does not want to put the United States in a position of going head-to-head with Russia. You have Ukraine's president begging for a no-fly zone, for some kind of military intervention. Is there any military option short of going to World War III here?
Well, there is, and that's continued support for the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and they're doing a tremendous job, obviously. But as you mentioned, it just in the question, the problem is Russia's control of the air, right? It's very difficult to reposition forces, to meet this multiple-pronged offensive with what you call interior lines, the ability to move across to one and defeat them in detail, which is what you would want to do when the Russians control the air, and then also the sea as well. So I think there's probably a military option there to tell the Russians, hey, you don't own the Black Sea. And then also, I think, to open up commercial traffic again, to alleviate humanitarian suffering in Ukraine, as well as to keep open the land routes coming out of Poland, Moldova, and Romania to resupply, I think, the Ukrainians with weapons. And I think that's very important as well. I think Putin got a lot more than he bargained for. He's in a very difficult position. And I think anything we can do, obviously financially, going after his international criminal enterprise with sanctions and so forth is important, but the support for Ukraine's ability to defend themselves is also important.
Does that mean when Kyiv falls, the United States should fund and arm an insurgency in kind of a Cold War-style proxy battle? Well,
I think the Ukrainians are going to fight. And I think what Putin didn't understand, this isn't an autocratic regime like his, right, where it's conducive to decapitation. The Ukrainian people are fighting for their freedom. They're fighting for democracy. They're fighting for one another and their sovereignty. And that just doesn't go away if he's able to seize Kyiv. And I don't think seizing Kyiv is in the cards in the immediate future. The next 72 hours, I think, are going to be really critical. I think what you have to look at is when you look at the map, it's important to look at the scale, Margaret. You know, and it's really easy to look good crossing the border at the beginning of an offensive, but you begin to reach the culminating point where you run out of logistics supplies and your force gets more diffuse, and then your supply lines are open to interdiction, and so I think this multi-pronged attack that you show on the graphic, you know, it looks good on the map, on a chart, but it's actually quite difficult to execute.
We heard our own David Martin lay out why that may sound reassuring, but is also actually scary for civilians because Russia may use less precise weapons. We have seen what Vladimir Putin is willing to do in Syria. He backs a war criminal who used chemical weapons. You heard the UN ambassador say that's not off the table. He's threatening to potentially lean into nuclear by saying he's raising his threat level. Right. Is Vladimir Putin a rational actor at this point?
I don't think he's a rational actor because he's fearful, right? What he wants to do more than anything is restore Russia to national greatness. He's driven by that. He's also driven by a desire to remain in power till at least 2036. And so I think now he knows that all of that is at risk, right? That the Russian military doesn't look very good right now. He doesn't look very powerful. And this is going to jeopardize his ability to stay in power. You know, real wages in Russia.
Do you really think that?
I really think that, Margaret.
Why do you think that there's actually a real threat to him staying in power? I mean, he humiliated his intelligence director on television.
Yep. Well, that's a sign, isn't it? I think that's a sign. When he had to humiliate his intelligence director on television, what does that mean? It means everybody around him is telling him what he wants to hear. He's living in a bubble.
So who could stand up to him?
Well, I think the Russian people could stand up to him. Now, the problem is that any of these, you know, the protests that we see, they're immediately put down. But it's worth noting, Margaret, you know, there are more people in Russia's internal security service than there are in the Russian military at this moment. What does that tell you about how secure he is? There are more political prisoners in Russia than there were during the height of the Cold War. What does that tell you about how secure he is? So I think these totalitarian leaders, they can look strong, but they're actually very brittle. And, democracy, as we've been, self-flagellating for the last several years, I mean, as ugly as democracy is, democracies are actually pretty darn resilient. And you see that with the Ukrainians. And I hope the Ukrainians inspire confidence in all of us across the free world.
I think a lot of people like to hear the optimism here, and it's kind of refreshing to hear in that way. But then you look at the international system. You served in the Trump administration. There's a lot of criticism of the international system. And parts of it, while it may be revitalized, it does look a little bit creaky. I mean, Russia is baked into the UN Security Council charter.
Yeah, right.
They are vetoing
Absolutely.
moral outrage. Yeah. They have a vote in this. They can use the international system to their advantage. So doesn't that fundamentally cause a problem?
Hey, I mean, freedom's not easy, right? I mean, and so we have to work hard, I think, to maintain the international order that has benefited people across the world. And it's at risk now because obviously what Russia's doing. But how about the relationship with Russia and China? How they're aiding and abetting one another. I think it's really important to look at that at the joint statement that was made just before the Olympics and the call for a new type of international relations. You know what that means, Margaret? That means rewriting the rules in a way that cuts against our interests and benefits the two authoritarian regimes that are trying to dominate the Eurasian landmass.
So how do you interpret Xi Jinping, the president of China's call to Vladimir Putin to urge him to negotiate a settlement? Does that say he thinks maybe this is going too far? And is Xi Jinping the only person who can rein in Putin?
He's not going to rein in Putin. And what he's doing, I think, is creating the facade of maybe being an advocate for peace, just like he's always been, remember?
Because the White House would say, oh, look, China's afraid of secondary sanctions. Even China is now afraid of the world standing up to Russia.
Well, they might be afraid of secondary sanctions, and they might get them. I think they deserve them, actually, for aiding and abetting Russia. What Russia and David Malpass will be able to talk more about this than I can. But they've been trying to insulate themselves, right, from economic sanctions, and they're doing it in cooperation with one another, right? He's trying to reduce his vulnerability to restrictions on his access to the dollar economy by buying yuan. China has pledged to buy even more and more oil and gas from Putin. And I think what we have to do next, we have to figure this out, Margaret, is we have to sanction the hydrocarbon sector. I mean, we have to do it. We have to do everything we can maybe to buffer the effect of that. But I think Europe, Germany in particular, has to realize they made a big mistake when they gave Russia coercive power over their economy. And so we have to make major adjustments to the energy infrastructure globally.
So I spoke to Kurt Volker, former envoy to Ukraine. He said to me, when you have a balance of forces, you have strength. Both sides have a reason to settle through diplomacy. When it's only one side imposing its will by force, diplomacy is capitulation.
That's absolutely right.
So should Vladimir Zelensky do anything to negotiate at this point?
Well, I don't think he has to. I think, again, this next 72 hours are going to be really important. Russia's initial aims have been frustrated. The military problem gets harder and harder for them as they extend their lines of communication and supply lines. If you look at the numbers of forces, it looks like a lot, 160,000. Okay, about 1/3 of that is combat troops. Now you divide it across 4 different axes. It's pretty easy for that force to become dissipated and to become absorbed in the vast territory of Ukraine, a country of 40 million people that occupies the space of Texas, right? So I think that this is an impossible military problem for him if his aim is to not only remove Zelensky from power, but then to control Ukraine. He won't be able to control Ukraine.
Thank you very much, R Mcmaster. We'll be back in a moment.
Thanks.
For more on the potential global financial impact of the war in Ukraine, we turn to the president of the World Bank, David Malpass. Good morning to you. So much has happened in the past few days with even bigger sanctions on Russia. Tomorrow morning, when they wake up in Moscow, do you expect to see a run on banks?
Hi, Margaret. We haven't seen the details of the sanctions, but they also yesterday talked about and announced that they would be hitting the central bank of Russia. So one thing to watch is the ruble. That really affects the Russian people. They've been having a hard time. This is a tragedy right now for Ukrainians, for the neighbors of Ukraine, but also for Russians. Their per capita income has fallen below China's. So as you think about the sanctions, it it hits the banks in Russia, but apparently not the oil and gas industry. Mm-hmm. But if they're able to stop the central bank of Russia from operating, that would really have an effect on Russia and the people. We'll see what happens tomorrow.
There was sensitivity to disrupting the oil markets and also exposure to some of the European countries, which is why they're weaving those sanctions sort of carefully there. What do you think the impact will be if you hear of sanctions on petroleum products? I mean, Iran's oil industry has been sanctioned.
Right. In the short run, there is upward pressure, including on LNG, liquefied natural gas, that the U.S. ships to Europe, and Europe will need a lot more. But it's available. Markets look forward, so they can look at the 5-year time horizon and realize that there's a lot of energy available if it's mobilized. There are alternatives to the Russian dominance of the gas market, for example. And so whether those changes are made will be important. I think also important is Iran. How quickly is it going for nuclear weapons? Because it's a source of oil in the world as well.
Because those negotiations diplomatically are at a key decision point.
And Russia's a full player of that. So how are you going to negotiate within that? We don't know.
No, that is a good thing to have on the horizon, another reason for concern. One of the other things you have been working on is you met personally with the Ukrainian president just about a week ago, I believe, in Munich.
That's right.
So what are you doing to help the Ukrainian government?
We're doing everything we can. And we're in a good position to do that right now. We have an instrument that is able to move quickly in the next few days if it's needed, and the circumstances go that way. I briefed our board on Thursday, and it can be added to by other countries that want to support Ukraine. And we also have instruments moving that can help the refugee flow. You know, as you heard earlier, the big flow going right now to Poland, but there is also the possibilities. Ukraine has a lot of borders with Romania, with Moldova. We have programs in those countries that can be added to support the refugee flow. So this can work. There can be the G7 is meeting finance ministers on Tuesday morning, so I'll meet with them and the central banks of the G7, and they can decide a lot of how much aid goes into Ukraine. The IMF also has. We're working with them closely to assess the needs and to think about instruments.
Is one of the decisions to be made what to do after the government falls? What will happen if this is a government in exile or this is an insurgency? Does help to the Ukrainian people continue?
I'm not at all at that point. So we're not trying to look at hypotheticals or contingencies. It's that we are doing everything we can to support the people of Ukraine, the people of the region, and also thinking about this tragedy for the Russian people, that they didn't choose war. You know, the phrase in Russia is "Нет войне," which is no to war. And so it's not clear how this is all going to play out. One thing is, the arc of history is for Russia to be closer to Europe. There's all this talk about China, but that's not a natural alliance. It's more. So in 1989, I was on the border of China and Russia, and people were wondering, are they going to get together and work together? No sign of that for the long run. Russia wants to use China with the SWIFT. They have a mirror system that can connect payments with China. I'm not sure this will go very far.
Big picture, what's the impact for the global economy? Do we see a spike in food prices and oil prices?
Yes, big concern, and it was already at a point of fragility because inflation really hits the poor, and this is going to drive up energy and food. We can wait and see what Russia does, what China does. Right now, China is buying more from Russia and allowing the sanctions to be eroded or circumvented a bit. We'll have to see where that goes as well. Okay. A big thing is the U.S. can supply a lot more if it puts its mind to it.
We'll watch for that.
Okay.
David Malpass, thank you for your time today. We'll be right back. The war in Ukraine is being fought 5,000 miles away, but its impact is being felt here in the United States. Here's Mark Strassman.
Stop Putin! Stop the war! Unease now invades America from a thuggish land grab a half world away.
You can't look away. It's deeply traumatizing.
Especially for roughly 1 million Ukrainian Americans.
How is it possible in the 21st century that you have an invasion of 200,000 men on an innocent country?
Thousands of those innocents could become war refugees, a Ukrainian diaspora that could reach America, joining Ukrainian communities in New York and California.
This region is really open for the refugees.
But all Americans feel something vaguely unsettling. Within this Russian blitzkrieg, potentially ominously, the rise of a second Cold War. In the U.S., the assault's other front line is economic. Its impact on inflation, with the consumers already squeezed by rates at a 40-year high.
We are going to see higher prices at the pumps. We are going to see higher prices, not quite as high as the pumps, in the grocery store.
Our global economy faces a double whammy: the ripples from new sanctions on Russia and worsening supply disruptions. Russia's a leading producer of oil and gas and rare earth minerals, titanium used in airplanes, palladium for semiconductors, like the chips that cars need. Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, grows wheat and other food crops. Europe's impact will be more direct, but we'll feel it.
The sanctions will weigh on economic growth, and the sanctions could potentially also make companies feel very vulnerable at a time when everyone's nerves are frayed after the last 2 years.
The Ukraine crisis also complicates a critical decision coming up for the Fed: whether to blunt inflation by raising interest rates. Get it wrong, and there's the specter of a new threat: a recession. Margaret?
Our Mark Strassman reporting in Atlanta. And that's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.